Is the war really over? Trump and Zelensky have made a decision. A night of humiliation for Russian air defense. The oil industry is burning again. Putin's plane will be shot down in the skies over Europe. An unexpectedly bold statement from Ukraine's partner. And epic footage of a Ukrainian special forces unit eliminating half a company of mercenaries in Donetsk region. That's what we're going to talk about right now, friends. I'm Alexander Prepodobny, and this is the Razborka Project. Let's go. Friends, please welcome Roman Svitan, a military expert, to the Razborka Project. Roman Grigorievich, hello, we're glad to see you.
Greetings. I wish everyone good health.
In addition to discussing the situation at the front, of course, and the situation with strikes, including those on Russian oil refining facilities and Russian strikes on Ukrainian territory, there's something else I'd like to discuss with you. Zelensky says that it's quite possible the war could end within the next 6 months. And I'd like to discuss this with you. How likely do you think this is, considering that the Russian Foreign Ministry says Russia will not agree to a ceasefire unless the root causes of the conflict in Ukraine are resolved? What will actually happen?
Well, we need to understand what it means for the war to end. The war will not end as long as the Russian Federation exists in its current form as a state entity. It's practically an empire. The Russian Federation consists of 21 republics plus several dozen other state entities of various levels, all gathered into a federation, but in reality, it's an imperial structure. The imperial objective, which is essentially being carried out right now, is to expand at the expense of Ukraine, to seize new territories. That's how it survives. It lives as long as it expands. And so these objectives will not disappear. No one will ever take them away as long as the Russian Federation remains in its current state. It's the remnant of the Soviet Union. So, until it breaks apart into its constituent republics, the 21 republics that make up the Russian Federation, and the 22nd, which they added by including our Crimea in the Russian constitution, that's over the top like busting in blackjack. So, until that happens, the war will definitely drag on and continue. With some disruptions, or say with a decrease in intensity or an escalation like it was with Minsk 1, Minsk 2, and now they might prepare a Minsk 3. Because any pause in hostilities, or however anyone wants to call it, a halt to the war, is just a breather for the Russians, which they will use to their advantage. As an operational pause to build up forces and resources, to develop new types of weapons in order to move forward later. That's why the war definitely won't end. What is being discussed now, a halt to hostilities or an attempt to freeze the fighting along the line of contact, looks more like Ukraine's capitulation. Why? Because the Russians remain on our territory. We're not on their territory, they're on ours. And since they're on our land and the fighting stops, we commit not to reclaim the occupied territory by military means. That's capitulation. Because any army engaged in combat must achieve the goal of forcing the enemy's army to cease armed resistance. But here it turns out people are running around with the idea of ending armed resistance. Well, since they're on our territory, that means we're capitulating. So if anyone talks about stopping the fighting, stopping the war, then just put an equal sign and read it as Ukraine's capitulation. So who's going to agree to that? Who agrees to Ukraine's capitulation? Yanukovych was willing to capitulate Ukraine in 2014. Where is Yanukovych? Well, that's exactly where all the authorities will end up, or those miserable ones standing nearby who are now also trying to capitulate, that is, to sign documents of Ukraine's capitulation. They'll end up where Yanukovych did. In this sense, from the perspective of stopping the fighting, nothing will happen for sure. They won't stop. Two armies, each deployed with practically 500 to 700,000 troops on either side. Hundreds of thousands killed on both sides. More than 100,000 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory are occupied. What kind of ceasefire is that? Nothing like that will happen. So we will continue to destroy Russian, unless someone stops us. The destruction of Russian ILOs can be stopped, just as it was stopped last year in May and this year in March. But if they don't stop us, we will continue to destroy the Russian economy, which will eventually lead to the collapse of the Russian Empire, just like what happened to the Soviet Union. There's nothing new to invent here. The Soviet Union was already brought down by these very mechanisms. The 10-year war in Afghanistan and the decline in oil-dollar revenues. Only now the mechanism is different. It's the destruction of Russia's oil industry. This is essentially the same reduction in oil-dollar revenues. The Russian economy won't withstand it. That's the only option. There is no other option.
Oh, there's a lot to discuss with you about the oil industry and in general Russia's energy facilities. I'll just add as a side note that at the moment some interesting reports have come in from Bulgaria. They said that they would allow Putin's plane to pass through if he flies to Budapest. But the Poles, the official Ministry of Foreign Affairs, responded that they would not let Putin's plane through. It would be forced to land, so they cannot guarantee the safety of the flight. Thanks to the Poles for, well, what I think is a clear and understandable position on this issue. Arrivals? In the Rostov region, the power station encountered flying sanctions. Our viewers can see on the screen how it happened. It was also a hot night in the Russian city of Bataisk. There, the arrivals are visible. Please comment on the strikes on Russian targets over the past 24 hours. What stood out to you?
The strikes are ongoing now. You can already see systematic work being done against Russian targets. And that's exactly what I'm talking about. Most likely, serious professionals have now become involved in planning these strikes. Moreover, these are professionals who are demonstrating a specific algorithm for destroying Russian military targets and objects of Russia's military economy. This algorithm is very precise, very competent. Why? Because this destruction is being carried out according to a specific plan. And all the hydrocarbon facilities that are being taken out. Thirdly, in just a month, this has already cost the Russian economy at least $1 billion, if not more. So this is a real factor and it works synergistically. You need to keep accumulating these effects, just keep carrying out further strikes. And in principle, these strikes will eventually lead to the collapse of the Russian Empire through the collapse of its economy. For example, just in the past 24 hours, there were strikes on Ataysk targeting the youth sector. This is one of the main railway hubs, which is very important for us because right now a significant flow of Russian military equipment is passing through it in preparation for the second wave of the summer offensive, which is currently ongoing. The Russians are now carrying out up to 200 attacks per day along the line of contact, mainly on the southeastern front in the Zaporizhia and Donetsk directions. And it is mainly through Bataisk that the reinforcements are coming. Of equipment and ammunition, which is probably why our strike assets were directed there. If you look at the video footage, it's unlikely to be a drone. I think it was a missile strike, at the very least a Neptune, or maybe, yes, something up to Polyanisia, or not Polyanisia, maybe up to Flamingo. There is such a possibility because the warhead is quite hefty, several hundred kilograms. You can get as far as Rostov from here. Bataisk is near Rostov. It's a railway junction, and these strikes are continuing. And we're hitting railway junctions, so we're stopping Russian logistics, and we're stopping Russian energy, oil, petrochemicals, and gas processing. Recently, there was a strike on Orenburg. That is the work of the Ukrainian professional army is visible. I specifically emphasize this. A professional army, something like the UPA, only professional. Ukrainian professional army, why? Because now, preparations for carrying out combat strikes are already at a high level. Most likely, professionals are working. Production, quite a large number of drones. Breaking through Russian air defense. Right now, it's very difficult to break through Russian air defense because they've increased the density of their frontal air defense. So we're still reaching them head on. Certain mechanisms are being used there. There are decoy drones, jamming systems. It's an entire process. And then there's the exit, passing through Russian territory and approaching the target directly, either destroying it or breaking through the site-specific air defense. From the perspective of aviation training, these are highly skilled professionals at work. So we can congratulate our armed forces, our professional Ukrainian army, on achieving this status. It has already been confirmed at the very least by their performance.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
Roman Grigorievich, just to wrap up this segment we're discussing, you mentioned the facility in Orenburg, where there's a gas processing plant and also the Novokuybishevsk plant, meaning both a gas processing plant and an oil refinery. They halted their operations after the drone attack. Reuters reports this, citing its sources. So the work is indeed visible and very important. I want to ask you about the front line. There are various reports coming in. Near Kostiantynivka in the Donetsk region, for example, fighters from one of the special units, Phoenix, eliminated almost half a company of occupiers and destroyed a Russian T-62 tank. 2 vehicles, an ATV, and a piece of equipment called Shtora. Please tell us about the situation around Kostiantynivka and where the most dangerous areas on the front are right now.
The Russians are currently putting quite a lot of pressure on Kostiantynivka. Why? Because they pushed us back to Chasiv Yar, they pushed us back to Toretsk. There are major problems in the Kleban-Big area. They have practically semi-encircled Kostiantynivka. Obviously, they haven't fully encircled it because more than 90 degrees of the sector is still under our control, but they've come right up to Kostiantynivka. Some groups are already making incursions into Kostiantynivka. Of course, they're immediately taken out. Assault companies are operating, but nevertheless, the enemy already has this opportunity. Why do they need Kostiantynivka? In order to approach Druzhkivka, Kramatorsk, and Slovyansk from the south. The Kostiantynivka garrison doesn't allow the Russians to hold that opportunity. We have a fairly significant troop presence there, right in Kostiantynivka itself. There is an understanding of the process that the Kostiantynivka garrison must be held, otherwise we will practically fall back to Slovyansk. This would become a very serious problem for the Kramatorsk-Slovyansk agglomeration. That's why we will hold Kostiantynivka for as long as possible. At the very least, we have that opportunity there. And if we increase the troop density and the intensity of fire in that direction, then in principle, Kostiantynivka can be held. The question of whether the Russians will intensify combat operations is no longer even relevant. They have already reached 200 attacks per day, and sometimes even more than 200 attacks per day along the entire eastern front line, from Vasilivka to Kupiansk. The most difficult situation right now, strategically speaking, is in the Huliai-Pol area. To the east and northeast of Huliai-Pol, the Russians are trying to break through to cut off the Huliai-Pol garrison and to reach Pokrovske, not Pokrovsk in Donetsk region, but Pokrovske, which is north of Huliai-Pol. Their attempt to break through our defensive line, roughly from the Huliai-Pol-Pokrovsk line, is showing positive momentum for the Russians. They've been advancing quite steadily over the past few months. If you count from the beginning of the year, they've moved more than 10 kilometers there. This is what they call the Vuhledar direction. So for us, that's currently the main problem from a strategic point of view, at least. We absolutely cannot let them through because reaching Pokrovske would allow them to cut off our Huliai-Pol garrison and essentially approach Zaporizhzhia from the Donetsk side along the Donetsk-Zaporizhzhia highway. At the moment, this is the most dangerous direction, even though it's not the one with the most Russian pressure or troop concentration. But judging by the number of forces and resources deployed by the Russians, which will be conducting combat operations over the next month and a half to 2 months, this is the Pokrovsk area. West of Pokrovsk, they're already trying to push through between Krasnoarmysk, Zapadna, and Pokrovsk. And in principle, there is also some positive momentum there. They are encircling Pokrovsk from the north, having already passed through Rodinsky. So in that sector, there is at most about 10 kilometers left that can still supply Pokrovsk. And if the Russians continue advancing at this pace and we do nothing to counter them, we could lose Pokrovsk. The situation is just as difficult in the Kupiansk area. That is, they already control almost half of Kupiansk, at least with long-range strike capabilities. And there are already some Russian military units inside Kupiansk. We are holding the southern part of Kupiansk there, and losing the Kupiansk bridgehead would also be dangerous for us, especially for the slippery left bank bridgehead. One of the main logistical supply chains passed through Kupiansk. For our left bank Kupiansk garrison, Kupiansk-Uzlovoy, Barvaya, all the way to Lyman, in the direction of Lyman. That's why there are difficulties there as well. There are difficulties practically along the entire front line there, starting from Orikhiv probably, and there are serious battles now somewhere up to Kupiansk, and they will continue for another month and a half to 2 months until the winter frosts set in. Although the Russians, based on the current objectives facing their rear units, are also preparing for the winter military campaign. So you can already see preparations there, starting from bringing in winter fuel, which means fuel with certain winter additives, and ending with preparing personnel to operate in winter conditions. Because the Russians most likely will not pause during the transition period. By transition period, I mean autumn.
Roman Grigorievich, I'm also reading a report about how the Russians have advanced near Malinovka and Poltavka, that's in the Zaporizhzhia region, near Kalininskoye, and in the Dnipropetrovsk region. Could you please tell us what their objective is in this direction, if possible?
This is exactly Pokrovske. That's the general direction. It's towards Pokrovske. If you look at the map, it's perfectly clear. They are trying to bypass Uli Pol from the northeast and the advance towards Pokrovske, including through Malinovka. That's the general direction. It's very dangerous for us. They could cut off our route to Zaporizhzhia, and that would be a problem. So the faster the operational level commander responds to this kind of Russian advance, the better. It will be easier to drive them out later.
All right. Roman Grigorievich, I can't help but ask you about those tomahawks everyone has been talking about this past week. Do you think this topic is finally closed now that Trump has announced a possible meeting with Putin? So was it a kind of blackmail and did it work? Or are there still some chances to get these missiles?
How many times have we talked about this topic so as not to be disappointed later? Let's not get our hopes up. We didn't get our hopes up, so there's really no reason for us to be disappointed now. It's clear that this was an element of blackmail to make Putin be the first to call Trump after their rendezvous in Anchorage, and I say that deliberately because it looked more like a transaction. Those contacts in Alaska, most likely they couldn't agree on something there, maybe not even related to Ukraine, different areas, Middle Eastern, Arctic, whatever. So Trump got offended, acted all sulky, and had to scare Putin with tomahawks. Well, naturally, with Ukrainian assistance, that is on the Ukrainian stage. We were used again in this sense. It was clear that this is how things are done, especially after Putin's call to Trump. They settled all their issues regarding disagreements, and there would be some further contact. But that contact also has to lead to something. If it doesn't lead to anything to Trump's wishes, then most likely the question of tomahawks will come up again. And this time we might actually get a few tomahawks. Technically, it's possible, and actually quite quickly. There are ground-based launches, as we've discussed before. The Pentagon, for example, is also interested in deploying tomahawks on our territory from a military standpoint. The closer the launches are to the enemy, the better, the greater the combat range for using these missiles. Moreover, both Ukrainian and American forces could use them. Why not, after all? They're their missiles, after all. This is exactly what the Soviet Union once fought against, moving the missile silos, including those for cruise and ballistic missiles, as far away as possible. That's why there were entire crises. Remember the Cuban one, for example. It was precisely because of this. The closer you place your launches to the enemy, the better it is for you. That's how it is for the Americans, for the Pentagon. Right now, I'm not talking about politics, but about geopolitics. I'm talking purely about military matters. So the closer the launches are, the closer the Typhoons are stationed, from which tomahawks can be launched at Russian targets, the better it is for the Pentagon's military. That's why, in this sense, we already have, you could say, an ally within America itself. So the Pentagon, that is the military, will definitely be pushing this issue, and we have already indicated our willingness to accept it. We've already made that clear. So don't rule out this possibility. Maybe it will happen at some point in the future, but the possibility definitely exists. And in this sense, there's no reason to be disappointed anymore. In other words, no one is putting an end to this topic yet. Moreover, as we've discussed before, for us, it's very important, not even so much the Tomahawk missile itself, but the launch platform. The Typhoon launch platform is multifunctional. In addition to Tomahawks, it can also launch SM-6 missiles. That's a surface-to-air missile system with a range of up to 400 kilometers. In order to ensure protection against Russian KABs, certain types of aerial bombs, and Kh-59 missiles, you need to be able to reach Russian Su-34s at distances of around 200 kilometers. This SM-6 missile can reach up to 400 kilometers and intercept Russian aircraft. So in this sense, it would be great, of course, to get, even if it's just a dozen Tomahawks, but at the very least, 4 Typhoon launchers. Sorry, I mean Typhoon, that's the correct name. Typhoon is a bit different. Typhoon is needed to operate these kinds of missiles to create a certain SAM system for destroying Russian aircraft. That's why we could gain such a multifunctional capability here, and it definitely shouldn't be discounted.
Thank you so much. Roman Grigorievich Svitan was on the air for the Rasborka project on the Ukrainian Today channel. Thank you. See you next time.